Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm talking to Dominican friar and jazz pianist Father Basil Cole about the moral effects of music. Hi everyone, just want to make a quick announcement before we get into today's episode. There will be no episode next week, and possibly the week after that. I'm taking at least one, maybe two at most weeks off just to go visit family in Virginia, but rest assured the show will resume in early August at the latest. Alright, I've got a really fun interview for you this week. My guest is Father Basil Cole. Since 1998, Father Basil has been a professor at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. He teaches courses there in spiritual, moral, and dogmatic theology. He has co-authored a number of books on the consecrated life, most significantly Christian Totality, and most recently The Hidden Enemies of the Priesthood. Most relevant to this episode, he's the author of a book called Music and Morals, which itself is based on a longer dissertation that he wrote while he was a professor at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, also known as the Angelicum, where he taught for 12 years. Like me, Father Basil is a jazz pianist, and I really enjoyed talking with him about something that I myself have spent a number of years thinking about. You're going to hear us talk about the question from every angle. What are the moral effects of music? What kind of virtues are required to listen to music well? For what reason should one listen to music? And even the question of whether you have to be a good person to be a great musician. By the way, if when you're listening to this interview, especially early on, and you think to yourself, why the heck is Thomas talking so much? The only reason for that is just that as the interview got going, I realized that it had been about 2 decades since Father Basil had read his dissertation, so I needed to establish some context for some of the ideas that we were talking about. But it becomes much more of a back and forth, especially once we're done talking about Plato. And Father Basil has a lot of wonderful insights, so if you get sick of hearing my voice, just be patient, because the whole episode is not just a monologue by me. Many thanks to Father Benedict Crowell for facilitating the technical side of this interview. Father Basil Cole, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So I just finished reading your 1992 dissertation. It's titled The Moral and Psychological Effects of Music, a Theological Appraisal. I really enjoyed this dissertation of yours, not only because I agree with just about everything you say, but because you look at the whole record of philosophy and theology on music in the Western tradition with such care and in such what I've learned to be the Dominican spirit of making all the proper distinctions. And it was also really nice because from the very beginning, you made all the same arguments that I've been making for years. So it felt really good to be...
Another kindred spirit.
Yeah, exactly. So we're both jazz pianists. Could you tell us a little bit about your background as a musician and how you came to being a musician to being a Dominican and writing this dissertation?
Well, I had to start playing for dances the piano with a small group back in 1952. And so I used to play dances or for special occasions, that sort of thing. And our group we called the Skylarks. It was basically dance music. And then I learned to play Dixieland jazz at the same time. And then as I got older, I started to be influenced by Dave Brubeck and others. And so when we would play for dances at colleges, Stanford, UC, Berkeley, and all that stuff, then I started to play much more, contemporary or less Dixie, less swing, and more whatever you want to call progressive jazz, we used to call it in those days.
More improvised.
Improvisation, yes. And then when I thought I had a calling to the religious life, I don't want to get into that. That'd take forever. But anyway, when I entered the religious life, I had more or less played jazz, I guess 10 years. We were never in the union. We were non-union members, and we never recorded anything. We didn't make, our money came just on weekends when we played. And we played a lot in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, huge, even as far away as Fresno, Stockton. And anyway, then when I entered into the religious life, I remember the novice master saying, I don't want anybody playing any jazz or any music, etc., except classical music. I'm fine. I figured that was my trial and temptation, etc. And I never bothered to play much piano until much, much later. And I don't believe, I think maybe when I was 5 years into religious life, one time the student master gave me a penance at the chapter to play some piano music for the community of students. We had about 35 or 40 guys at that time. And so I basically mocked the religious music that we were playing, we were singing. It was, in English now, it wasn't chant. It was sappy, saccharine, wretched stuff. And so I just made fun of it. But then when I was in France studying, I was asked to play during the famous May Revolution of 1967. In France, my class is called, we are the 68. And that was during the explosion that took place, general strike and all that. And then I all of a sudden found myself playing some really strong music that just flowed out of me, even though I hadn't practiced much. And I remember Father Congar getting very upset and walking out. But that didn't bother me.
Yves Congar?
Yes, I knew him.
So he didn't like jazz?
He hated it. They all did.
Oh, no.
The older generation.
Oh, my gosh.
Passion. So anyway, then over the years in the order, I'd occasionally played for the brethren, and that was it. Then when I wound up teaching in Rome, the dean asked me, he says, well, look, you have the license and the lectorate, which is a Dominican degree. How about writing a doctorate for us? And I said, okay, I don't have to prove myself. I was already preaching parish missions. I was a preacher, not an academic per se. I was preaching missions. But then I thought, well, maybe this will do some good. So I kept wondering, what should I write on? And one of my professors, Father Kevin Wall, since deceased, said, write on music. I said to myself, what am I going to write on music? What am I going to say? And then it became clear to me that I really needed to understand what was music doing to me? What does music do to others? That sort of began my dissertation. And I remember that I had as I say in my book, I had a tremendous experience listening to Benny Goodman's famous jazz concert of 60, 70 years ago. No, wrong, 80 years ago at Carnegie Hall, listening to Sing, 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 which is still on the, very popular on the YouTube. It just it gave me such a delight in the throat, I guess. So that became to me, well, what was that delight? What was that delight about? What was that delight causing? And was I trying to do that playing the piano? And I think I was, but I wasn't aware of it. It's like I talked to a Dominican sister who used to be a dancer, a ballerina. I said, what were you trying to do? And she couldn't put it into words until I eventually came to what is an aesthetic experience and beauty about and all that stuff. And then boom, she kind of got the concept. It was just a couple of days ago, the discussion. That sort of began my journey into writing my work, which I never thought I would, have I didn't think I would ever sell the book or get that popular, but it was a thing to do. But it was a passion I had to do this. Who am I? What was I trying to do? What do musicians try to do? Why do they do what they do? All that stuff. I think that hopefully in a long way answers your question.
Oh, yeah. Another thing you mentioned in the dissertation is that you were sort of provoked to start thinking about the relationship between music and morals in particular by the hostility that some of your older clerics that you knew had towards jazz and their belief in the sort of, I don't know, Richard Weaver vein, that it was basically morally degenerate music, even on the level of the sound, the melodies, the harmonies, and the rhythms that were in themselves morally degenerate. And that was sort of what got me interested in the philosophy of music as well. I had a problem with the idea that, as I heard some people say, and this is not I don't think this is a very common opinion anymore, but you do still have people who say, such and such a beat is inherently lustful or something. And that always just seemed like a category mistake to me. I mean, I don't think that sentence even really means anything. It's like, how could a bass line be lustful? I mean, it doesn't supply any of the content that you would need to be lustful. So I always would argue that it was more a matter of association. So
right. Context is what you were saying. Yeah. Where did jazz begin? Quite often in whorehouses, and the word jazz has a sexual meaning, so therefore the music that comes from that must therefore be immoral. That would be the logic, right?
Yeah, of course, I've heard jazz historians dispute the meaning of the word. I don't think we really know where it comes from, absolutely. And same with the origin. Right. Same with the origin in whorehouses, because if you really think of it even on a practical level, the idea that jazz all comes from the New Orleans red light district, it can't, because that was just piano players in whorehouses for the most part, but jazz also comes from march music, and there's a lot of different influences, so it can't just come from whorehouses. That was one place that it was played, maybe in a certain instrumental setting, right?
Sure.
But yeah, I agree that even if that were the case, that it doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that the sounds themselves are inherently immoral. And the philosophical...
Guilt by association.
Yes, exactly. So the philosophical argument that's often given, and I'd like to start here before we get into just musical sound itself, I'd like to sort of clear this philosophical position off the board, is usually based on Plato. And it's a specific what I would call a facile interpretation of Plato. It's sort of an understandable one in the sense that when I was opposing this interpretation, I thought I was opposing Plato himself, but then I just realized that people weren't properly understanding the context of Plato's remarks. So the Platonic view would be something like, well, Plato says certain modes... whatever that means in the ancient Greek context, which is mode means something itself means something different from even the medieval modes. It's not even really a scale per se, but certain modes have certain moral effects, and they imitate movements of the soul or emotional or moral states. And I can't remember the specific examples, but he would say something akin to, the Dorian mode causes you to be upright and alert and orderly, and the Phrygian mode or whatever causes you to be lax and effeminate, things like that. But there are so many problems with just taking that at face value and say applying it to a rock drum beat or a jazz groove or something. One of the biggest, and I think the most indisputable one, which you bring out so well in the dissertation, is that Plato, when he uses the word music in Greek, means something rather different from what we mean. So could you go into that a little bit?
If I remember, it was melodies with words. It was a fusion of poetry and discourse and music. That's part of the thing that's involved here. It wasn't pure melodies. It was poetic stuff, and then he also had a thought on particular instruments seem to have bad associations. But again, it's a long time since I've read my book.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like what you said in the dissertation. I think even broader, music is the art of the muses. And so that includes anything that the muses inspire. It could be oratory, it could be dance, it could be a combination of all these things. So, that raises a problem right away in simply applying Plato's views to music as we understand it today. You could apply it to music with lyrics. You could apply it to music as used in movie soundtracks, or operas, and many things you could apply it to. Just as a side note, it's interesting because we're talking about associations of music with different words. And it's not just, I think in Plato's view, the reason he says that certain modes cause certain effects is not that it's just dependent on the individual piece of music and the words that are set to it. It's that we are dealing with a society, as I think most ancient societies were like, where certain types of music were used, musical forms and sounds and instruments were used specifically in certain social contexts. So I would make an analogy to in Indian, what's called Indian classical music, their use of ragas. They have specific ragas that are only used at a certain time of the year, at a certain phase of the moon, in a certain religious context, in a marriage, so you can see why he would think that certain modes have, certain moral effects. We take that and apply it to just a series of notes, which I don't think is even really what he meant. And I think if he did mean that, he was wrong. But I don't actually think on further thought that is what he meant.
And didn't Aristotle kind of follow that too, if I remember? I thought he talked about similarly, and so did
I think he did.
And Confucius. Yeah. Confucius has
yes. Confucius had almost the identical concern, and they both also talk about the effect of changes in types of music on the city, on the nation. And now that I'm talking about these modes and their contexts, that actually makes there's this very long held belief, which is taken from people like Plato and Confucius and carried forward in whatever civilization that this view of music developed, whether it's the Chinese civilization or a Western civilization up through, say, the Renaissance, that if you change the music, you change the society, and if you change the music, the laws will change and things like that. But if you think of a social situation where music is used in very stratified, specific ways based on tradition, now I can sort of see, as I'm thinking about this, why Plato or someone else might say, if you change the music, the laws change. Because if a certain type of music or a certain instrument or a certain mode is only used in a certain setting, and then you go and switch it because you're being artistically creative, and you use that same mode with a different words or in a different setting, but you still have the association from the old setting, that could be very confusing, right?
Yes. In our case, I think what changed a lot of stuff was not the music, but the music followed the Enlightenment period. I think if you look at the Enlightenment starting in the 17th, 18th, and then eventually in the 19th century, musicians started to play around in an extraordinary sort of a way anyway, that takes me too far afield.
Sure. Well, no, we'll get there for sure, because I want to get to talking about what you call pure music. And that's primarily what I'm interested in, because I myself mainly play instrumental music.
Mm-hmm.
So going along with this Platonic view is the idea that music imitates or expresses, if not moral qualities, then at least specific emotions. And I actually pretty sympathetic to a writer that you mentioned in your dissertation, the 19th century Viennese music critic, Edward Hanslick.
Oh.
And I think you take a more nuanced view than he does, which is good. But Hanslick argues that music does not, in the strict sense, express emotions. That doesn't mean it doesn't have emotional effects, that emotions aren't incredibly important to the common experience of listening to music, but that strictly speaking, the emotions are not the content of the music itself. And he's arguing that the music is essentially sound organized beautifully, well, hopefully beautifully in time. So the reason I mentioned him at this point in the discussion is that I would even question the view that just because you feel an emotion while listening to a piece of music, that means the music itself must be expressing or imitating that emotion. And even further, even if Plato is right that music or all art is about imitation, as he says, if he's right that music is imitating, say, an emotion, that doesn't mean that it inculcates that emotion in the listener any more than if you watch a movie that has a character in it who is angry, you necessarily become angry yourself.
Correct. I like that. That's a good distinction. Yes.
I'd like to ask you about a specific comment you make about some of the people at the time you were writing who were against jazz. And you suggest at the very beginning of this that, quote, dogmatic personality types, unquote, who want to be in control of everything may feel threatened by the creativity of jazz. I just want to know, how much do you think that sort of wanting to be in control has played a part in the approach of philosophers to music over the centuries?
I have never thought of that, the way you put it, but it's speculating. Some people always think they're infallibly right about taste. Why do they think that way? It has to do with perhaps the way they were trained from their parents. Maybe mom and dad were always that way. And then what else can I've never, you're posing a question, I haven't thought about it too deeply, but I was thinking of absolutists, not of morals, but absolutists of music, that I am always right, and therefore, if I say ipso facto, this is terrible stuff and terrible, I am, you can't disagree with me. This happened in my college days with a lot of my professors. They wouldn't want to discuss, they wouldn't want to nuance, they wouldn't want to distinguish. They just came to certain conclusions, and there was no discussion. And so, as a result of perhaps hearing jazz, maybe for the first time in some cases, the variety scared them, maybe, or the variety forced them to reconsider, and then that might have interfered with their self-identity, because part of beautiful music, even the classics, is surprise. Great music has to have some kind of a surprise in it, melodically, harmonically, etc. And of course, jazz is filled with improvisational surprises. Listen to it carefully. And if you're a control freak, you like to be able to get a handle on the music. You like to be able to predict. But great jazz is unpredictable. Even if you listen to it again and again, there's certain things that you think you picked up, but you didn't. But if it's in a jam session, oh my heavens, there's kinds of creativity going on. And some people get frightened by this. That's why some preachers like to have a text in front of them that they can hold on to, and that they're in control. They can't possibly veer from their text. It shakes them, etc. They can't possibly get a new idea in the middle of their homily and then all of a sudden develop it. It just, their identity is such that it's static. They're afraid of going off into a thought they hadn't thought before. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And there's an element of risk there.
Yeah.
If you're going to be extemporaneous in any setting, whether it's musical or oratory.
Some great jazz musician says that if you make a mistake, make it into something that's not a mistake. Work around it, deal with it.
That's right. I think Ornette Coleman said that, but he wasn't the only one.
It was Ornette Coleman. I didn't like Ornette Coleman, but you're right. I prefer other sides.
But it's a good quote. Yeah.
It's a great quote. And I think there's just some people that can't deal with that.
Yeah.
They're perfectionists, and that spills over in taste. Okay.
But I think if you want to get into the transcendent, there's a paradox in music and in art that if you want to get into the transcendent, you have to risk imperfection.
Yes, that is correct.
Because if you're in complete control, then that means it's not coming from somewhere higher than you.
That's true. I'd go along with you there. Yeah. That's even true in the spiritual life. That was too far afield. The gifts of the Holy, when you have to take risks like Mother Teresa did and all that stuff.
Well, right, because virtue is a sort of control in a sense, but I think that virtue itself has to be transcended. And I don't mean in the sense of left behind, but isn't that right? Wouldn't you say that in the spiritual life, that virtue is not the highest goal?
Well, the theological virtues are meant to be expressed. And then when you're faced with unusual circumstances or deep commitments, then the gifts of the Holy Spirit kind of push you beyond reason. Not against reason, but above reason. And you can sometimes do things that others would say is nuttier than a fruitcake, like Mother Teresa, leaving her order and feeling, she was doing a great job as a sister of Loreto and everything was going fine. But all of a sudden, God was asking her to leave it and do something that required constant risks and not knowing the consequences.
Right. And Miles Davis would always talking about the importance of playing beyond what you already know, just at least a little bit beyond what you already know.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And that happens with all the great arts, I think.
So another aspect of control I was thinking about with the philosophers, and, unfortunately, I think this is true, not only of the ancients, but pretty much of all philosophers dealing with music up until the 19th century, and even most of them in that period. I think that there's always a great respect for music, I think,
yes.
with only a couple exceptions. I think Kant might have described it as being akin to wallpaper or something like that, but he might have been an exception to that. I may be thinking of someone else. I think it was Kant. But the philosophers by nature are people who work with concepts. And
yes.
Of course, that's especially true now when philosophy is not viewed in, say, the sense that St. Justin Martyr would have used it, meaning, love of wisdom in the most in the fullest sense, not just of knowing about something, but having a relationship with it.
Yes.
So philosophers being people who deal with concepts and put a great value on their own profession, I think are loath to allow the non-conceptual to have a high value.
Yes.
And one thing...
They're into ratiocination, reason, and...
Right, discursive reason.
There's intuition.
Yes. My view is that the intuition involved in music is super rational. I don't know what you would think of that. That creative intuition is a super rational thing. So we can get into the positions of the philosophers on music vis-a-vis concepts, but do you think that's a reasonable position to take?
Yes and no. I think one has to distinguish what do we mean by super rational. The way I like to look at it is, you're pushing me here. I haven't thought of this stuff in so many years. Yes, I teach other courses now. Super rational usually refers in theology to the gifts of the Holy Spirit, pulling your intellect, your knowledge of the faith into a deeper understanding. I would say that it's certainly not unrational. It's certainly not sub-rational like an animal, but it's somehow, I'd say it's beyond rational because it entails something more than A equals B equals C equals G, or A plus G plus G. It's not that kind of... with music and with the arts, we have an absolute concrete certitude about being. Oh, now we're getting into metaphysics.
Yeah.
I haven't thought of this in years and years and years, so you've got me here.
No, that's great, though.
Right, beyond rational, but not against it. That's right. It. It's not against reason. It's not above the truth, but it's somehow in the truth. It's an aspect of truth that's different from ratiocination truth. That's it. Or as the way Jacques Maritain put it one time this goes way back, in Art and Scholasticism, you don't get a knowledge, you don't discover knowledge in the arts, you get an experience of being in art. Being in art that touches the intellect. It's not knowledge of being, it's an experience of being. So in that sense, it's different from reason. That would be the best way I'd put it. I've been floundering here since you pushed me.
So my other sort of thing to provoke the philosophers would be to say music is higher than philosophy because philosophy tells us about reality, but music adds new things to reality. In fact, so in music, you're actually making more reality in a sense, whereas philosophy,
you're not making,
unless you're
discovering. Yeah. But also, you're now into the whole issue of philosophy deals primarily with the truth of being and the truth of mobile being, the truth of the cosmos, whereas the arts treat with beauty. And beauty is a separate category or a separate transcendental, if you will, of being. And so can you say that being is higher? Well, yes and no. It depends on what you're looking for. So we have to sometimes know what's right and wrong, and that's certainly better than listening to Bach's Brandenburg concertos. But on the other hand,
Sure.
you need to listen to Bach's Brandenburg concertos for other purposes and other reasons.
Yes. So going back to Plato and this idea of being a little bit hesitant to give value to non-conceptual things. And of course, this is especially exacerbated with Plato, given his whole view about everything in the world just being an imitation of a higher reality and almost being illusory. Maybe illusory isn't the right word, but you mentioned that he was not in favor of music without words, which was pretty rare, I think, back then anyway, because for him it was mere pleasure without meaning. So interestingly, he also says that, he says in the Laws, and you quote this in the dissertation, when there are not words, it is very difficult to recognize the meaning of the harmony and rhythm from the words, or to see that any worthy object has imitated them. And that sort of, I think, actually backs up my argument that the meaning is not in the sounds themselves, that it is in the words. Because one thing that he's nervous about, music without words, is that, well, what does this mean? There has to be a meaning, it has to be teaching and, forming you in some moral way, some easily intelligible moral way, or else, there's something a bit suspect about it. It's interesting. And probably my favorite thing about your dissertation is that you bring out these subtle advances in the understanding of music from philosopher to philosopher, because you're so thorough in looking at the different statements. So one of the things in Aristotle is that he agrees with Plato that he pretty much assigns music the same moral function, but unlike Plato, he also legitimizes listening to music for pleasure. And I believe, if I'm not misremembering, also not just mere sense pleasure, but intellectual pleasure as well, which is a big step.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that eventually will lead Thomas Aquinas to speak about the light that's in the beautiful objects, the lumen.
Now, getting back to the question of morality, and the reason we've been talking about these functions of music in terms of what music does is because I think that the acknowledgement by Aristotle and others that a valid use of music is for intellectual pleasure, I think that is a sign that you don't have to see it purely in terms of direct moral formation. Isn't that right?
Correct. Yes. Mm-hmm. Some music is didactic and it's going to be beautiful, but that's not your primary purpose when you're creating something beautiful.
Right.
But it can have an effect in a very profound way in morals, as I bring out in my dissertation.
Now, I think one of the key things from Aristotle that you bring out in the dissertation for the purposes of our discussion here is he says that music forms us morally by teaching us to, quote, rejoice rightly, unquote.
Yes.
So this means that we're not talking about a particular piece of music imitating a particular moral state. We're talking about music in general, if it's good music.
Yes.
It forms us morally by teaching us to rejoice rightly. And I think that actually says the entire thing. I think everything is right there. So could you expand on that, what that would mean to rejoice rightly, and what part that plays in the moral life and in the Christian life?
Oh boy, I'll be dominating conversation if I continue on that one. Well, I think
that's all right.
The first thing to keep in mind, it seems to me, is that we all, absolutely speaking, need delight. Delight of the beautiful produces in the soul a host of wonderful consequences. It takes away excessive tension, and lots of tension can lead to committing sins. All kinds of capital vices can emerge as a result of stress, tension, number one. Number two, we all need the delight of play, as St. Thomas reminds us, because it's a release from, as I just said, tension, and there's another word, I can't think of it right now. which in turn then strengthens our souls to be able to get back to more intense work, the work that we have to do in our particular vocations. It's more than taking a swim. All right, but going further, what happens in great music, good music, you have an exemplary cause of what virtuous should be. That is, reason flooding the emotions, so that you don't make moral decisions exclusively from raw feeling. You make decisions that from right reason that influences feeling, shapes feeling, especially the irascible side of our personalities and the concupiscible side of our personalities. And so, like great music, the life of virtue should be flooding, reason should be flooding the emotions and setting them in place so that we can live the spiritual life, the moral life, dedicated to right reason, influenced by faith, hope, and charity. So then that means that music becomes like a dispositive cause. It doesn't force us to virtue, but it incites us tries to persuade us to do something what beauty, or musical beauty, or poetical beauty tries to do, and that is to put reason into artifacts, whether it's a stone, whether it's gestures, whether it's words, or whether it's melodies, harmonies, and rhythms. So all of that stuff then is in some natural way giving us a kind of a exemplary cause, saying this is what human virtue should be like concerning the feelings as well as in the human interpersonal relations. For example, when you go to a symphony of Bach or whatever, you've got 1,000 people attending. We all feel united as one. Well, if we could only start thinking of the human family and the dignity of the human family as such, the dignity of the human person, then the desire to be fair and just to others can be aided and helped. And that's why great music should be part of an educational system in grammar schools, high schools, universities, and the like. But I mean, I can go on and on, but that's enough for now. Am I hitting the nail on the head, or are you disagreeing?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. What I want to get at is this idea that listening to beautiful music may dispose us towards contemplation of the divine, or towards contemplation in general.
Yes, that's that's a course I'm teaching next semester. Contemplation, virtue, and beauty, and the arts, and their inner coalescence, why they're necessary. Everybody's called to be a contemplative. The issue is, what do you contemplate? I mean, criminals are great contemplatives. That's the wrong kind of contemplation. Criminals, they meditate, they ponder, they look for ways of robbing a bank or murdering somebody. They try to commit the perfect crime. And if they succeed in robbing a great bank, then they delight in the vice that they've done. And so we deal with the opposite side of virtue. It's similar. Meditation, thinking, then contemplating the results of your meditation. So what happens in great, beautiful music or great, beautiful poetry or great, beautiful plays is you are a receiver. You are in the receiving mode. You're not in the active mode. You are in the mode of careful listening, a careful receptivity in an active way of the beauty of the art object. As we develop that side of our personalities, then we also become more apt at listening to people, our children, if we have them, wife, husband. We also develop the ability to think more deeply about action, what we should do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody has got to be a contemplative. It's what you contemplate on that's important. But then also, it's the arts enable you to develop this side of your personality to be able to receive truth, to receive right reason, to receive hints. I mean, if more If more husbands and wives had learned to listen to beautiful music, for example, they'd be more apt to be able to listen to signs of discontent or signs of things that are inexpressible or can't be expressed verbally, if you get what I mean. This is extremely important.
So you've just touched on an important part about the type of contemplation we're talking about, which is one that ultimately goes beyond discursive reason, and it goes through the senses, but it transcends the experience of the senses as well.
I think Maritain and Gilson and others and thinkers, including me, we call that knowledge by connaturality.
Yes, that's right. And what that actually means is that your mind conforms itself, if I'm not mistaken, to the thing being contemplated.
In itself, yes.
It is becoming like it. And so in a sense, you're identifying with the thing contemplated, and that is sort of what love consists in, isn't it?
Yes, the will and the intellect, or they're separate faculties, they interpenetrate. There's an excellent book by a Dominican friend of mine, Father Michael Sherwin, where he goes into how love and knowledge interpenetrate. But I can't remember all of it. I haven't thought of it. But yeah, that's part of what's involved here.
So I think the other important thing about this type of contemplation that we're talking about, there are a lot of different ways to contemplate music. You could talk about, if you're using contemplation in a broad sense, meaning reflecting on things, thinking about them, analyzing them, whatever. But what I'm talking about is, I think, the proper mode, which is in an intuitive sense.
Yes.
If you're doing that with music, then what you're doing is you are enjoying could use the word beauty, but we could also use the word goodness, the goodness of the thing contemplated for its own sake in that moment. And I think that is very important in relating this to Christian contemplation, insofar as you are supposed to be appreciating what is good and beautiful for the sake of its own goodness and beauty, and not for any sort of instrumental purpose that it can serve.
Yes. St. Thomas seems to teach that in many places, but he doesn't develop it, that beauty is an aspect of goodness. It's the last transcendental. Truth, goodness, and then beauty. And then the beauty is somehow related to both truth and goodness. But anyway, that would be another conversation. But you're right.
So music can be a sort of, and other forms of artistic contemplation and contemplation of nature and things like that, can be a sort of a school of contemplation, which can attune us to taking delight in what is good, and to taking delight in what is good in a way that is beyond our reason in one sense or another.
To take delight in what's been revealed. That's what theological contemplation is. Thinking about the Trinity, resting in the Trinity, resting in the knowledge you have of the Trinity and the very Trinity itself as it's in your soul through faith, hope, and charity. And then also all the other aspects of our dogmatic teachings are the substance of contemplation. The more abstract and the concrete. Trinity being the most abstract, Christ's humanity being the most concrete, Mary, the mother of God, very concrete. Anybody can think of Christ Jesus suffering on the cross. Not many people can contemplate the processions within God. The Father's generating the Son, the Father and the Son inspiring the Holy Spirit. That takes a little more understanding of study and what that means.
Right.
But anybody can think.
When you relate this to what is contemplating what is revealed, are you saying something along the lines of music is just a given? It comes from the artist, it comes from God through the artist, and the listener does not have to be able to understand it or understand the way in which it was made to be able to contemplate it?
That's correct. If you did know the author, the writer, the musician, if you know the science of creating music, that's going to even add to your experience.
Right.
It's not the essence of the experience, but adds to the experience. And again, that can prepare you for prayer. It can prepare you for theological contemplation, very much so, as well as preparing you for being a good husband and a wife.
Right. Yeah, I want to come back to that idea, that aspect of knowledge and the science of music in a moment after we wrap up this section of what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to read you a quote and get your reaction to it. This is a 19th century English psychologist named Edmund Gurney. He was actually a contemporary of Hanslick. I don't have any indication that they read each other, but they come to very interestingly similar conclusions. Although I think Gurney is more nuanced and has more to say as a psychologist about why, even if music does not express emotions per se, why it has this mysterious relationship with them nonetheless. But anyway, the quote I wanted to read, this is from his book, The Power of Sound. He says, "I am still more anxious not to seem to ignore the indirect moral and social power of music, already enormous and capable of enormous increase. I believe as firmly as anyone that if in life we may promote happiness through morality, in art we may promote morality through happiness. But this belief will gain and not lose from a recognition that moral and aesthetic excellence are not Siamese twins, but twin sisters differently beautiful."
That's great. I like. There's a lot in there that needs to be pulled out. Okay, they're not identified, yes, but they are, or they interrelate, yes, coalesce, yes. One is not the other. And sometimes some beauty can be actually immoral, okay? But other than that, if they go together, that's all the more because, as he put it, indirectly, that word indirectly is the same as a dispositive cause, indirectly of creating morals. So that's why they should be symbiotic in some way, but not identified. Truth is distinct from beauty, and goodness is distinct from truth, and yet they all have to they should all be interplaying throughout our lives.
Right. Just to clarify, when you say beauty can be immoral, am I right that you mean not in itself, but it can be used? It can be put to immoral purposes?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. And then people can write beautiful novels that undermine the beauty of the goodness of a nation or the goodness of a person. You might write a poem that is highly insulting and highly revealing of the faults of others, or you can. And pornography itself is showing beautiful bodies, but for a horrible consequences.
Right. Got it. So what do you think of this idea of promoting morality through happiness in art?
Well, keep in mind, what is happiness? We cannot not will it. It's part of our being. It's a sign of our incompleteness. We all necessarily seek fulfillment. We all necessarily seek bliss. We know as Catholics that the ultimate happiness is the beatific vision that in turn fulfills us with love and goodness and the like. Okay? So all that fulfills us in some way is an imitation of the infinite goodness of God. A good meal is in some way an imitation of God's goodness. A friendly gesture brings delight and enables people to develop friendships, friendliness. So likewise, beautiful experiences can enhance the desire for God because beauty of itself is a participation in the being that is God's beauty, which is infinite. Well, now we're dealing with philosophy again, I know. Is that making sense? Should I make some more qualities?
Yes. We've talked about the possible moral effects of music. I'd like to look at the relationship between music and morality from the other end of the relationship for the listener and then for the musician himself. So let's talk about how does one listen to music virtuously? You talk in your dissertation about the role of temperance in listening to music. So what would that look like?
Well, again, it's relative to individuals and personality, but sometimes you can waste time when you should be doing other responsibilities. You can go into excessive listening to music. Again, but what is excessive for you may not be excessive for me. Just like eating food. For one person, eating 4 hamburgers is reasonable. For another person, eating a half a hamburger is unreasonable. We call that's the relative side of temperance, more or less, excess, defect, and all that stuff is relative to individual vocation, individual talent, individual circumstances. A guy who's a professional musician has to be playing the piano 6-7 hours a day to keep in tune with himself, especially classical musicians, if that's their calling, if that's their vocation. So that would be my first thought. Second thought is that it's important that one develops a sense of taste so that one doesn't just simply use music as background to sell things, but rather listens to music for all the right reasons, number one. And number two, tries to increase one's ability to appreciate deeper music. It's one thing to like jazz. It's another thing to also like Bach. And it's also another thing to like Telemann. It's also another thing to spend time with varieties of different musics and try to expand one's taste and not just simply lose oneself into exclusively only one form of music and maybe even a poor form of music. For example, all the rock stuff that you hear on the television, or you listen in the elevators, or you go into airports, it's trivial, it's trite. It doesn't summon you to any depth, you see. And you should be resisting that. You should be growing in a greater appreciation of better and deeper and more profound music. I think that's basically what I'm talking about here. And that's why I would call it the virtue of taste. It has to be developed like any virtue.
So you mentioned trite music. So here's an interesting question. Good music can be morally good for us insofar as it inspires us to contemplation and various other things.
All the rest of it, yeah.
Can music that is aesthetically lacking, granted that it does not necessarily have a moral content in itself, can that degrade morality in some way? I'm talking about just on a musical level.
I would say perhaps for certain individuals, it might be a sign of their lack of growth in virtue. But I wouldn't say in all cases, in all circumstances. Again, we're dealing with the individual persons here.
Sure.
And it's possible that listening to lousy music could lead to stopping doing something wrong. It could,
Right.
Having a poor taste, if your wife has the same poor tastes maybe that could lead to a good marriage. Follow me? It's possible.
Yes.
I know. She likes this junk, and so you kind of go along with it. You kind of you see there's something, and then that enables you to carry on a relationship that leads to marriage. Okay. So
right.
That's why it's more complicated than we realize.
So obviously having a preference for mediocrity is a bad thing in itself. But one thought I've had about this question is, well, okay, if you're listening to music that isn't good, that has no depth, then I think by definition you can't be listening to it for its musical qualities per se. I mean, there may be an aspect of mere sensory or aural pleasure to it.
Yep.
But that means that I think it's fair to say that the way most people listen to music is as a way of indulging one. Often they're not even listening to it, they just have it on. But it's a way of indulging a certain emotion. And it may be an emotion that they associate with the song, whether it's a sort of nostalgia or whatever. But there's an interesting point when you're talking about music towards the end of your dissertation. And you quote Joseph Pieper, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but he says something like, this type of music that is sort of blandly relaxing and all smooth, no edges kind of thing can be used to lull yourself into sort of a false sense of security and complacency. Everything's fine, and sort of an unearned peace. I think that it's an interesting point on his part, because it gets to the dangers of indulging emotions for their own sake. There's an Oscar Wilde quote about sentimentality, and I don't remember exactly what he said, but basically he said sentimentality is having an emotion without having earned it. So when you are sort of imposing your own emotional structure on the sounds, using the sounds as a way of sort of triggering these emotional feelings. It's not that the emotions themselves are immoral or are good or bad, but that indulging emotion for its own sake, because it's not an end in itself, is not really a healthy thing to do on a regular basis. Do you think that's the case?
Yes, I'd say that quite often people who listen to stuff like that, it's a superficial identity. It bolsters a superficial identity of oneself, of one's image.
This actually is interesting because it ties into something you said in a footnote in your dissertation. And I think you were referencing something Maritain said, but I think these are your own words. As every musician knows when composing, he feels within not only beautiful sounds, but his own very being itself, much as a knower in knowing being knows something of himself.
Wow.
So what does that mean?
Well, let's start with a person who's listening to crud. A person who's just listening to a little, the same old rock and roll. I love you, I love you, I love you. And 3 chord changes, and this goes on and on and on and on. Well, it kind of is the reflection of a person who doesn't think very deeply about the spiritual life and perhaps doesn't think deeply about anything else and assumes that everything that he gets that's true is from the culture, from TV, from the internet and all that, and is not really truly free. He's wrapped in himself in a kind of a narcissistic world, and the music reminds him of and makes him feel comfortable in his narcissism. That's, the first thing that comes to my mind. Now, second thing, for the point of view of the creator who's serious, as he creates his music, he somehow discovers the mystery of his very being. He discovers that there's something in him that's more than what he receives from culture, from home, from country, from anything else. He discovers a deeper sense of identity as a spirit embodied. He discovers something of his very intuitive being, and he discovers something of his feelings for a lot of things that can't be expressed in words, but get expressed in the language of tones for the musician. That's probably true for the poet as well. I think that's kind of what I meant. This is the first time I've heard it in 25 years, so I think that might be some of my explanation of that.
Yeah, because I was going to say, I think as musicians discover themselves in some way when getting in touch with this inspiration, I think when you're contemplating music or anything, the same thing happens. So it's an interesting contrast between somebody bolstering a false identity with music versus actually discovering their true identity.
Yes, kind of going to the root of your being in some way and touching your higher intellect, if you will, or your higher feeling or your higher intuition.
And Bill Evans, the great jazz pianist, actually said that he thought the function of music was to show people a part of themselves that they didn't know existed.
Ooh, I like that. That makes sense. Yes. They're not just entertainers. There's more going on.
I guess the only other thing I'd say about the use of music to get yourself riled up into an emotional state is simply that, and this is sort of a restatement of what we just said, but when you're contemplating something outside of yourself, it somehow paradoxically also brings you deeper in touch with yourself.
Yes.
Whereas when you are retreating into yourself, into this sort of emotional fog of your own creation, that isn't even really serving the normal purpose of emotions, which are to prod us in one direction or another.
Yep.
You're retreating from the world and not discovering your real self at the same time.
I like that. Yes, I think that's true.
So something you said, which I think is even more exponentially more applicable today than it was when you wrote in 1992, is the danger of curiosity about music. And we're talking in terms of the inordinate curiosity described as a vice, the opposite vice to studiosity by Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
And you said that there's a danger when music is so easily accessible, such a broad range of music, in that you can be listening to an inordinate amount and hearing new things constantly on a very shallow level, not listening to things deeply, more than once. And there's a danger of not going deep into anything.
That's correct. Absolutely.
This is, obviously exacerbated in the era of streaming where you can get anything instantly on the internet. At the same time, recorded music, this is another great point you made in the dissertation. Recorded music gives people the chance to listen to things many times over. And so it allows people, in a sense, to get more quickly used to new sounds, which would have maybe disturbed people more in the past.
Yes. I remember when the first time I listened to Miles Davis, I thought it was awful. But I kept forcing myself to listen. And one day, his famous tune, So What, clicked. All of a sudden, I had a tremendous aesthetic experience because I was able to get used to the method of the melodies and the harmonies, and they matched. And then all of a sudden, I experienced the light that came from that particular piece of music.
So we've described some various ways of music, using music in a shallow way. I'd like to talk about a danger, and this also is a form of curiosity in the pejorative sense, that maybe people who are real music nerds are prone to fall into, in particular academic people, and that is the danger of intellectualism. Now, we've been talking about intellectual pleasure in music, but we are talking about something more on the intuitive level. And what would be the danger of sort of over-intellectualism or over-analysis in music?
The first thing that comes to my mind spontaneously is you become a snob and you look down upon people who aren't as bright as you are, that you have analyzed things so well, and you become a kind of a critic's critic, even though you try to analyze the music in such a way that you think your words can basically say what the music is saying. And of course, that's false. Those are the first things that come to my mind. Intellectuals.
Is there a danger, just as the person who is listening to music in an emotional way is almost making the object of his attention his emotions, that the person who overanalyzes or falls into analyzing while he's listening as opposed to at some other time to better understand when he listens intuitively, is replacing his own mental fabrication of analysis, replacing the music with his own sort of mental construct of analysis as the object of contemplation?
That can happen, of course. Yes. He just looks at the technique. He looks at the chord structures, or he looks at this, or he looks at that, and he thinks of you're basically running away from the depth and the joy of what is being given to you by the musician. And instead of receiving the gift that he's giving you, you're creating a different gift and of your own making.
Yeah, and I see that as a danger for intellectuals in general, not only when dealing with works of artifice, but that is a prime danger in the intellectual life.
Correct. You're right.
So one more thing on the morality of music from a listener's perspective. And this is a little esoteric, but I want to see what it brings up in your mind. Have you ever heard of, who Frank Serpico is?
No, I don't.
Okay, so Frank Serpico was a New York police officer in the early 70s, and he stepped up and reported massive systemic corruption in the police department of that time. And he was actually left behind to be shot in a crime situation by his fellow officers, sort of as revenge. And he survived. But they made a movie about him starring Al Pacino. Now, as further background, Serpico was a real eccentric, sort of bohemian type on the police force. He was into opera. He danced ballet. A real interesting, eccentric guy. So now when Al Pacino was talking to Serpico about playing the role, he asked him, "Why did you step forward and speak out about this abuse of power?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. I guess it would have to say it would be because if I didn't, who would I be when I listened to a piece of music?"
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that intriguing?
That is extremely intriguing. Now, what could that possibly mean? Perhaps he relating the idea that that great music touches his authentic being. And if he hadn't done what he did, he would have been, quote, inauthentic. And he would experience a tremendous contradiction between listening to the Bach that he loved and the corruption that he hated. I think that has something to do with authenticity, something to do with a contradiction here between what is truly beautiful and what is truly ugly and sinful.
Yeah, and what it makes me think of right now is the word integrity and the real meaning of that word as everything being of a unified whole, integrated whole.
Yes, that's better.
Because many people could very much appreciate beauty, and many people are able to compartmentalize those different parts of themselves. But it speaks to his integrity, not just in the obvious sense of speaking out about right and wrong, but in terms of the non-compartmentalization of who he is.
That's what I meant by authenticity. But you put it better that way. The authenticity sounds too generical, but you've put a nice handle on it.
And it goes back to that idea of music putting you in touch with a deeper part of yourself. And it's fascinating. I often think I would like to write, a book or an essay someday just exploring all the implications of that quote, because it is one of the most interesting quotes I've ever heard on the relationship of music to morality.
Mm-hmm. Well, start writing it tomorrow.
So the last topic I'd love to talk to you about is the virtues of musicians. And the first question to ask, and I think the answer is sort of obvious. It's an obvious no to this if you know anything about music history, but I'd like to know from a Thomistic standpoint, do you have to be a good person to make beautiful music?
No, not per se, because it's a different virtue of ours. Nevertheless, if you are a good person and you have great talent, then your talent is going to shine even more so, because what you say or what you write or what you play is a reflection of your being. Okay? So even though ours is a virtue of the mind and heart as an artist, and you can be great at it, but if you're also holy and you're also really, really good, then it's just going to enhance even deeper what you're already doing. In my speaking as a Thomist.
Can you go a little bit more specifically into why art or ours is a different sort of virtue than the moral virtues?
Yeah, that particular virtue is of making something outside of yourself. It is not. It doesn't generate virtue within yourself of prudence or of justice per se, or of temperance per se, or of courage per se. You look to creating a perfect work outside of yourself, absolutely speaking. That's why it's not called a moral virtue, but an intellectual virtue. Nevertheless, it can affect all the other virtues.
Sure.
By reason of content, by reason of intentionality, by reason of a whole host of other things, by your intentionality. But of itself, you're interested in producing a fine work, a beautiful work. That's in essence why we use the Latin word facere rather than agere to describe what you're doing as an artist. Artist in the broad sense of the word, musician in the particular sense of it.
Right. Craftsman.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. Flannery O'Connor quotes Aquinas as saying something like, I forget exactly the quote, but basically that prophecy does not require rectitude of the appetites or something like that. And she connects that to writing fiction. But it's interesting because in your dissertation, when you're talking about sacred music specifically, you talk about this idea that even though it's obviously important for a sacred musician to be devout, there may be such a thing as a charism that bypasses that requirement in a certain sense.
Charisms are a totally different other ballpark in the Catholic understanding, from going from St. Paul all the way to Aquinas, etc. A charism doesn't make you holy per se. It's meant for the needs of others, and we all have a charism of some sort. Everybody has a charism according to John Paul II, but it may not be a high one like creating miracles. It may not be a high one like being able to organize a church or something of that sort, or preach great homilies, but we all have something, and it's given primarily for the sake of others. However, as we exercise the charism with due diligence and deep love and mercy, so then it does have a rebounding effect upon our virtues. The other thing is that sometimes in the heights of mysticism, which is not in my dissertation, of course, but in the heights of mysticism, sometimes the gifts of the Holy Spirit also are conjoined with charisms. But that's another subject altogether.
Sure. It's interesting you mention in this context Jacques Maritain, and he did a great deal of work, and I think a lot of his work on art that is most directly Thomistic is the work on the relationship between art, specifically between the virtue of art, meaning that the artist's craft, and morality. He addresses it in a number of different places. He had a whole book on it called The Responsibility of the Artist. He also addresses it in his essay, Art and Scholasticism. But one of the things that he says is that even though art and prudence, what he says in terms of the moral virtues, even though art and prudence are distinct and have different ends, the artist must have virtues of a sort that are at least analogous to the moral virtues.
Yeah, well, maybe he has to be honest, first of all, and he has to intend to make something beautiful as best as he can. He can't fake it. That's a real virtue. And also, if he's paid to create, say, a statue, he's, has to get the best matter that he can of the stone or whatever it is. So there's a lot of little things that go along with it, having relationships to other people. Yes.
I have to share another Miles Davis related thing here, because Maritain also mentions high on the list a sort of self-denial that the artist must have in order to be faithful to his intuition and not just fall into, rote habits and say, if you're a jazz musician, falling into familiar muscle movement patterns or something like that, to where your body is playing the music more than your creative intuition.
Right.
But there's a great story that Keith Jarrett tells from the time that he was playing with Miles Davis. And Miles said, "Keith, you know why I don't play ballads anymore?" And he said, "No, why?" Miles said, "Because I love playing ballads so much."
That's a great way of putting it.
On a very practical level, if somebody listening perhaps has no experience listening to music in the way we've described, what would be a good practical first step in terms of sort of a deeper appreciation of music that doesn't necessarily require a lot of education or, scholarly work or anything like that?
Well, I would say, first of all, listen to something that's, first of all, by yourself. Listen to something that is not too long, and just let it bathe you with its melodies into your ears and your heart, and make an effort to actively receive what is being given to you through the artist. But don't listen to something that lasts an hour. You'll get bored. Something that's short.
That's a great practical point. Don't try something too hard. Don't try to bite off more than you can chew.
Right.
Yeah. And, this reminds me that one of the reasons listening to music is difficult, even for professional musicians at times and very musical people. Really listening requires interior silence.
Yes.
That's another way that music can prepare for contemplation, of course.
Yes, and prayer.
I have a good friend, a great pianist and composer in Virginia, who talks about music as being basically a preparation for silence. It comes from silence, and it prepares you to learn to be silent, which is almost even better in a way.
Yes, it's true. Great music, that is.
Yes.
Lousy music, no.
Right. Okay, well, Father Basil, thank you so much for doing this. It was a great pleasure.
Happy to help.
Father Basil's book, Music and Morals, which is a shorter version of his dissertation, is unfortunately out of print. However, we do have plans to scan and upload his dissertation to CatholicCulture.org. So when that does happen, I will announce it on the podcast and put a link in the show notes page, both in whatever episode I announce it in and also in the show notes for this episode, which you can find at CatholicCulture.org/episode 11. You've probably got plenty to chew on already from the interview you just heard, so this week's excerpt I'm going to keep short. It is Sirach chapter 32, verse 3. Speak, you who are older, for it is fitting that you should, but with accurate knowledge, and do not interrupt the music. If you enjoyed this episode of the Catholic Culture Podcast and you know anybody else you think would enjoy or benefit from it, please share it with them. And if you're a real fan of the podcast, please give us a rating and review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in 2 or 3 weeks. God bless you.